Through the years, I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time with, in my estimation, some of the most effective worship leaders of our generation. It's been in situations of co-leading with them on stage. That time has been spent sitting with them, dialoguing, interviewing them for training purposes, developing with them, growing with them in worship songwriter and worship leader circles and kind of development forums. It has been in the context of training and developing others through conferences and workshops and programs and online programs and calls. And I've seen a few particular threads that run through the lives, through the skill set, through the hearts of these men and women. And they're from across streams of the church. Not all of them are highly visible. They're not all recording artists. They're not all famous, other than in the hearts, in many ways, of their communities that they lead. But they all have some similar qualities to them that I call the qualities of great worship leaders. And I want to just enumerate some of those qualities, because I think for anyone who is asking God, am I called to lead worship? Is there something in me that you have wired to serve your church in this way? My small group, my local church, my area church. Some might have an opportunity to lead in spheres of influence that are much bigger than that. But at the end of the day, every worship leader is asking themselves, Lord, is there a place for me in your church to serve through my acts of worship leadership? And so I've done a fair amount of reflecting on this idea of what makes a great worship leader. And I've drawn on all of these threads that I've talked about, the skill threads and the heart threads, the leadership and influence threads, and I've kind of mapped out a number of qualities that I think make great worship leaders. When a church calls me a leader or a community, it could be some wild and crazy new experimental church, or even very traditional churches even in liturgical backgrounds. I'll have leaders across the scope contact me and say, hey, do you know of any worship leaders that could fit in our context? And I think about in those moments, what they're looking for is a great worship leader who can then take all these qualities that I've seen in worship leaders and apply them to the particular context and situation in which they find themselves. So what I'm about to say related to great worship leaders applies to children's worship leaders. It applies to small group. It applies to main session. It applies to conference worship leaders. It applies to youth worship leaders across the board. These are principles that can be applied to any different context. And the best worship leaders have this flexible quality to them, that they can quickly adapt to a new situation and be energized in it. They can find their way in it because they're always thinking about these particular qualities. So these are the kinds of people that I recommend when I get those phone calls. First of all, great worship leaders are consistent. And this word consistent, I think, is essential to understanding what it means to be a called and effective, and growing in our effectiveness, but a called and effective worship leader. Consistency. It's my deep belief that anyone can on occasion lead an effective gathered worship experience, whether it be around songs or liturgies or symbols or whatever it might be that we're leading worship within or through. But anyone could lead a worship set that every once in a while seems to hit the mark. Great worship leaders, I've found, though, have actually studied the art and the science of effective worship leadership. They know how to make the lion's share of a set out of songs that the people know and love and resonate with. They have intuitively grown each time they lead worship, kind of analyzing, are there any things that I could do better that next time might take us more quickly or more easily into a space where there's a sense of energy and life and meeting with God and one another that happens within that gathered worship context. These worship leaders understand this element of invocation, of starting things off then a celebration of God, then responding to God with intimate expressions of prayer and thankfulness. And they know when it's Easter time, or when it's Lent, or when it is Christmas, or Advent, or Epiphany, whatever the season is the church is celebrating, whether it's a baptismal celebration, or a wedding, or a funeral, whatever it might be, they actually understand that they're in a different context now. Whether they're on a stage in, some club somewhere, or they're on a stage in a church, they understand their context, and they very quickly begin to go through these ideas and how they could consistently and effectively lead people into a place of encounter, given the nature of the context. So great worship leaders are very consistent. They've learned how to build worship sets in a consistent and generally systematic way. They've learned how to connect songs together. They've learned how to get over feeling like they're quenching the Spirit of God if they plan very, very well. And there are a lot of tools worship leaders use to plan that I think are very effective and then enable the spontaneity and the random moments of decision to flow more easily, to flow in many ways, I think, more truly, to map more truly with the heart of God for a particular gathering. So they're consistent. They're not afraid of systems. Great worship leaders in that case know how to let the songs lead worship and to give the worshiper language for their own worship. They don't feel pressure to pray a lot or say a lot, to overdo the worship leadership end. They don't feel a need to be cheerleaders. They consistently create a space, and they know how to do it. They've learned, they've grown, they've taken courses, they've just received a lot of input, but then they've sought to apply it so that they would become consistent and strong at what they do every single time they lead. Now, the second quality I want to talk about is this idea that great worship leaders are equippers. Great worship leaders are equippers. Great worship leaders are very quick in their mind to want to move away from the platform themselves. Now, I'm going to qualify that in a moment. But they want to move away from the platform themselves in order to give others platform as is opportune, but as is appropriate, as is fitting with their spiritual maturity, with their maturity in their skill sets musically, in their ability to pastorally care for people, in their ability to technically plan and prepare sets. I, many years, have spent hours and hours a week simply mentoring others. And that seed was put in me by some of the most effective worship leaders I know. I remember when I first met a man named Andy Park. Andy has been a worship leader for many, many years in the body of Christ. And he is really what I call an anchor worship leader. He knows how to get the job done. He has learned all the intuitive skills, but all the practical skills needed to lead massive communities in worship and very small groups. He knows the recording studio as well as the stage, as well as the couch in a living room. And he's very good at what he does. And I remember meeting him for the first time in a small worship leaders retreat to which I was invited. And I remember watching Andy work with us, and I began to think, this guy is authentically trying to make us feel better about our role as worship leaders than he is about us feeling like he's very cool, like he's amazing at what he does. In that room that day, I remember feeling like this guy is after one thing. He wants to build me up. He wants to equip me. He wants to call me up to something. He wants to train me in a skill set, and he wants me to get out there and do it. And he's got faith for it, and I feel like faith is rising in me that I could do it because he believes that I can. And I remember coming out of that meeting, it was one of my first worship leader retreats ever, feeling like I could do this. I believe I'm called to do this, and someone is championing me. Now, what I didn't know is that probably over 20 years would pass as a worship leader. I would do all sorts of things in my own world, and often with Andy. I've gotten to do a lot of events with Andy, leading in the same context and co-leading together. And it has always been a privilege to think back to that moment and to think, someone decided they were going to equip me, and now I get to do it side by side with them along the way. Many other worship leaders have done that for me, but Andy's been one of those ones who always was trying to make a way for me to have a platform, to have an opportunity. God had put, it seems, faith in his heart for me. I am always looking for opportunities. And as I look out and I watch great worship leaders in action, they are always looking for opportunities to take what they have, no matter how small or insignificant they feel like it is, their level of experience, their level of learning, their level of gifting, and to see it imparted to someone else. They always, as in, I think it was John Wesley's kind of small group model, they always have their hand up on the next step, holding on to someone who's helping them grow. But then they always have their hand on another level, helping someone else grow. They are committed to not just doing this thing on their own. They want to develop others. So as equippers, they have learned, even in their artsy randomness, they have learned to systematically develop others, to have weekly gatherings for equipping, to invite leaders that they are working with into courses, into programs, into events, into articles, into other relationships that they have, onto platforms with them, side by side, working with them over a long course of time in order to see those other people placed in a role of influence that is built on their training and their development. Throughout the years, I've watched so many worship leaders that I have high regard for, that I deeply respect, investing significant portions of their lives into life-to-life mentoring and equipping exchanges. And when I talk to leaders of churches, those who call me and say, do you have someone? Always following on that is this question: are they an equipper? Are they willing to train others? Do they cling to platform? Are they very concerned that their own visibility be maintained? Or is there a generous spirit with what they know, with what they do, that they want to invest in other leaders, whether it be children's pastors and worship leaders or small group or otherwise? Are they an equipper, a developer of other people? Just a quick story related to very dear friends of mine, as I mentioned, Andy and Brian Dirksen. I remember them just telling this story that Andy was leading worship for a small group out in British Columbia, and he invited Brian to lead with him one week. And Brian was very young and just beginning to play guitar. And the next week, Andy called him and said, hey, I can't be there. I need you to take over. And Brian had to take over. And that was the deep plunge method of equipping. And I don't always recommend that, but in this case it seems to have worked, given their influence in the 20th and into the 21st century of worship leadership. But there is this quality where we want to develop people. We want to equip them. We want to invest in them. We sometimes may need to throw someone in the deep end as we discern that's what they need. Others I have taken years with to develop, to train, to mentor. And every time they thought they were ready, I usually thought they weren't quite ready for that platform they were pretty sure that they were ready for. Because there were heart issues, there were unseen things that I just knew out of sheer friendship and good leadership needed to be attended to before they were just thrust into situations of higher visibility. When we equip someone, we also endorse them in the community. So we need to equip and train people on a very basic level of instrumental skills, and then invest in them more completely as God begins to give us faith for particular people. But great worship leaders always have their antenna up. You know, they're just up there. Lord, who is the next person you're calling me to equip? What are you inviting me to do in my local church community that will expand us, that will enlarge our whole calling as a church, as it's carried and embodied by others, that will fuel the worship expression of that in our local body? Who are those people you have gifted me to invest in? I have another great friend whose primary investment is in people who are artists, who play in their cities and in their towns. And they also have a heart for worship and are worship leaders, but they're drawn to those people whose primary work is in the culture around them. I have a great affinity for that as well. And I see them just in their elements, going into those places, working with those people. We all have to say, God, who am I uniquely gifted to equip? And then in the same stroke say, Lord, who are you inviting me to equip in my community? So that we can release platform, release opportunities for worship leadership, and not simply cling to them on our own. I've watched many very respected worship leaders that many of you would know travel places always in tandem with someone else that they were developing along the way. And to me, that's just great modeling. In many cases, I've had people playing with me who weren't plugged into the monitors. And we left it that way for a long period of time. Even one very dear friend today who's an excellent, amazing artist and worship leader, who I think it was for at least 6 months to 8 months was a better guitar player than I was, but wasn't coming back through the monitor simply for some sonic needs for me, but also because I felt like God just wanted to touch something in him about platform. And he was already much farther in character than many people that I know, but there was still a hidden issue there. And I somehow intuited that his call would be much bigger than I was seeing that day. So I had to be the one to attend to that. But I still wanted to share the platform to get that interaction going. When it's been about equipping members of the opposite sex, I've always tried to do that in more public gatherings with others who are around us. I've always looked for a female worship leader who I could develop in some way in those kinds of contexts, and then get them developing other female worship leaders among us. And it's been a gift to watch just a flourishing of female worship leaders in the church today, but also to be able to do that myself and to watch others do it in the ways that are appropriate, to keep everyone healthy, keep everyone in a good place, because I want females, women sharing that life-to-life exchange with one another, men sharing that life-to-life exchange, and then in more public gatherings we can interact on a deeper level, but in a way that keeps everyone's heart tuned up. And I think that's another important idea in equipping. So great worship leaders are equippers. They know how to become older brothers and sisters in worship leading, and not to simply protect themselves or put themselves in the always leading role. Okay, great worship leaders are pastoral. Great worship leaders are pastoral. These worship leaders have a wider skill set than just playing an instrument, leading worship, or leading a band. Most churches, I've found, can't afford someone to just have that kind of limited skill set. They just lead worship, that's all they do. There are some that can, and that's a wonderful opportunity for many different very excellent worship leaders. But in many cases, they need someone to have a strong pastoral gift, to be able to pastor the bands, to be able to pastor other worship leaders, to be able to care for the extended worship communities and worship life of their church, to be able to carry a pastoral vision for the church. And then, I deeply believe this, most effective worship leaders, you see in their eyes when they get up there behind any microphone, you see in their eyes that I am here for you, you are not here for me. The community is not their audience. The congregation is not those who have gathered to watch them do their thing. They are there to serve, to nurture. They must become greater. In some senses, I must become less. As we make God greater and we become less, we want to fan and deflame the community. That is a pastoral gift. I remember a dear friend of mine who is a pastor, an excellent communicator, a wonderful spiritual influencer. He came up to me after a worship set one day, and his eyes were filled with tears, and he said, I get it now, Dan. And I said, what is it? What is it? What do you get? He said, I understand what that quality is in worship leaders that draws me to them and has always drawn me to particular worship leaders. I said, wow, what is it? He said, it's a pastoral heart. I feel like they are pastoring me as they lead worship. They are welcoming me. They're guiding me through their own lives of worship and their effectiveness in building sets and music and knowing how to build song flow into a set in a tight band and building that together and just the different elements of readings and symbols that they embed within the worship experience. I feel like they are pastoring me somewhere. They're discipling me. They're leading me. They're even guiding me by the words that they're choosing in their prayers, the songs they're choosing. These guys are pastoring me along the journey of worship. And I thought, wow, that's excellent. We want to grow in our pastoral skills. We want to grow in our ability to care for people. And that speaks a lot about our own wholeness as followers of Jesus. We want to always be in a state of growth, always be passionately pursuing God. And when we're not, we want to go back to our keyboards, back to our guitars, back to our dulcimers. Had to get that in there. Back to our instruments, back to others who can lead us in worship. We got to get back to it and find again that space of encounter. We need to get back to communion and back to just situations that enliven us afresh to our great hunger and need for God, that then leads us into a place of being able to woo others to that place of encounter. To me, that's the great gift of worship leadership. From our desperation, we pursue God and then open up doorways for others who are in their pursuit because they have permission to do so, because they've seen us in our hunger respond to God this way. So great worship leaders are very pastoral. Great worship leaders actually care for, they actually shepherd their worship teams. They are concerned that people grow and develop. And that means saying yes to people at times. It means saying no to people at other times. But always doing so out of a heart of great love, a heart to help guide people into their primary gift and their primary callings in the church, a desire to help people become those that disciple others. They are disciplers of disciplers in that sense. And they're always looking for how they can nurture the whole life of the community, how they can embody in worship sets what God is speaking through the pastoral leaders, through the teachers, in the community. When in a season of grief, I have watched worship leaders pastor their communities through the worship sets and songs that they choose. It is pastoral when a worship leader wants to do those 10 favorite songs they always love to do in their sets, and yet they decide they're going to learn a bunch of new songs. They're going to learn some particular songs because they believe that God is telling them to do so for the life of their community. For those worship leaders that are songwriters or have songwriters in their midst, they're looking for the gold that they can mine in order to serve pastorally the communities of which they are a part. I remember a worship leader, a very young worship leader that I mentored, was leading a worship set. And my wife was in a particular time of tremendous internal grief. She was wondering where God was. We were going through a lot of pain in our family life, and she was going through a lot of just personal calling pain. And this young worship leader got up there, and I knew the kinds of songs that he loved and would use often, and he moved to this place in the worship set and began to play a song that just unlocked my wife's heart. And she fell to her knees. She was weeping throughout the worship time, just engaging with God in a powerful way. And I went to him afterward and I said, hey, I didn't know you would typically choose that song. And he said, I wouldn't. But as I was praying about the worship set, the Lord spoke to me, there's someone here that needs that song. And I remember in that moment just my heart welling up. Thank you, Father, for a worship leader who listens. I don't always just want that song that's just for one person. I'd like it to be for a chunk of people, right? But if God whispers and we respond well, and we learn to respond better as we go along, something beautiful and magnificent can happen in a life that can't happen anywhere else. I remember leading worship in a conference once. And I'd chosen a particular set of songs, and it was a little more intimate maybe than I would spend over the course of an hour. This was an extended worship set. And I remember in the middle of this worship set, a young man began to just weep uncontrollably. His heart had just broken, and he was sobbing very, profoundly in the midst of this mixed church gathering. We had liturgical churches. We had very traditional churches, people from charismatic backgrounds. It was a very wide range of people that had packed into this large conference setting. And this young man began to weep just uncontrollably. Some people went over to pray for him, and others are like, what do you do with this? Other people are like, yeah, we do this all the time, And anyway, I just kept leading through the worship set. We finished the worship set, and when we're rushed out because of our time, we had things we had to do, and I left. I received a letter just a few weeks later from this older man. So I can't remember what age he was, but he was, I think, beyond his 20s and even into his 30s. And it was a letter from his mother that I still keep in my file. As a young man, he had gone through significant traumas. When he was very, very young, he was out, I think, on a camping trip with his father, and he watched his father drown in front of him. And it traumatized him severely, of course. Then, just a few years later, something had happened. He was doing something, babysitting, and something very traumatic, not by his doing, by something else that had happened to this young one that he was watching, and this little girl died. And this man went into incredible trauma. He emotionally became jammed up. He couldn't speak and couldn't emotionally express himself. And his mother was writing to me that for the first time in years, something was unlocked in him, and he began to be able to express himself emotionally before God. And I said, you know what? I got better things to do than to get up on a stage and make this about me and my latest licks and my cool rendering of this song and my way of doing it and my set and my visibility and all that. When someone is sitting in that community that God wants to speak to, wants to unlock, and I have the privilege, the opportunity to participate with God in that, that is worth it. Me plugging in speakers and getting there early to rehearse bands and do all the hard work that is worship leadership has to be about more than me and my ego. It has to be not about taking, it has to be about giving in a community. And we get to do it, whether it's in a small group, whether it's in a large group, whatever the context, in a funeral home, in an old folks home. We get to listen to God and be pastoral in that context. Well, the next thing I'd like to say about great worship leaders is that great worship leaders are proficient. Great worship leaders are good at what they do musically. Great worship leaders are skilled at their instrument. They're always seeking to grow. I've watched very effective worship leaders in many contexts always learning new instruments. I've begun to lead worship from the keyboard, where I've always typically led it from the guitar or in recent years from the hammered dulcimer. And as I grow, I'm finding that others are being given permission, unspoken, to grow themselves. Great worship leaders aren't always the best musician within their band or their context, but they do want to grow. They have the ability to defer to others who might have better arranging skills, who might be better musicians. But at the same time, they're not all called to be the best musician in the band. They're called to be the worship leader. That is a gifting, it's a calling from God, and that doesn't always mean that we've got the best chops, we've got the best licks, that we can always articulate everything we need to articulate to the band. Yet at the same time, it does mean that we are called to lead. And I've had to lead many great musicians, great artists, and creative leaders through the years as band members, not because I was the best musician, but because I had God's hand on me to effectively lead people into a space of worship. And I know many of the most effective worship leaders that we respect and honor in the world today would say that same thing. They surround themselves with great musicians, and they pastorally and in an equipping way lead those musicians to a place with humility and with honor, with dignifying the community. They are able to humbly lead people into a place of celebration or adoring worship or lament or just renewing prayer. Great worship leaders are good at what they do. They're always growing. They're getting better and better. And if you can be a great musician and a great worship leader, that's fantastic. but always be growing beyond where you're at. Always be looking for opportunities to be inspired yourself musically or creatively, and then to put that into actual time and energy put into growing on your instruments. So great worship leaders, they are proficient. Great worship leaders understand authority. Great worship leaders understand that someone else lies awake at night asking God, what is your heartbeat for our church family? Where are we going? And they honor that. They defer to that. They don't just take their worship set over 5-10 minutes every time because they think they're in charge of that part. Great worship leaders understand mutual submission. They're able to understand who's got what division of labor. They're able to dignify and honor that as they live out their calling. And I believe great pastors and other spiritual leaders understand that intermingling of gift mix. But everyone has a role to play. Some people are greater among equals in a certain context, and they need to lead. We need to respond to them. I've always worked on having great eye contact and communication with whoever is the primary leader of the gathering that I'm the worship leader for. I want to know if they're saying, I think we need to end early. I want to know if they think we should keep going. I want to know if they just think we need to end on time because we've got a tight schedule of events. I deeply believe that a great worship leader can lead people effectively into intimate, beautiful, powerful worship with one song as much as they can with 10 songs. In 5 minutes, as well as they can in 50 minutes, or a half an hour, or 15. Worship leadership and great worship leadership effectively creates a space, understanding authority, understanding who is in charge of what, and deferring to that with honor and dignity, and real mutual submission. So I believe when we do that, then we get honored in the background. And that's something I believe is just a David thing. If we honor God in that, we will find that God will honor us along the way. We don't need to fight for our platform. God will take care of that if we honor others and honor Him and His call in our lives. Great worship leaders, and this is the last one that I want to expand on. Great worship leaders are passionate. They're passionate about what they do. They love to lead people into worship. And this is one of the primary sort of criteria that a worship leader should ask themselves. Does this cause my heart to come aflame? That doesn't in and of itself mean that you are primarily called to be a worship leader. It might mean you're just called to passionate worship. But if all these other elements are there and people affirm those, and there seems to be some sense that that's at least in seed form in you, these other ideas related to great worship leaders, then I believe that these things are mingling together. But the passionate always lead. In society, in the church, in culture, the passionate lead, even if they're wrong. Really, even if they have a screwy worldview, we find in culture the passionate always seem to be leading. Why? People are moved by passion. They follow others' passion. They're inspired by it. They're renewed by it. How much more should we be passionate about what we do as worship leaders so that others are inspired to draw near to God, to hunger after God, to make these songs more than just melodies and harmonies and fabrics and textures of music and words and visuals. We want people to get beyond that into a real threshold encounter with the living God as a community. Where do they get that? Where does that come from? It comes in many ways from leaders who model that, who live that, who embody that. And then people grow in their passion, in their hunger for God, in their longing for God. So great worship leaders are passionate. So let me just do a quick review here. Great worship leaders are consistent. They can, over a long course of time, on a regular basis, effectively lead worship gatherings. They understand flow. They understand how to build sets. They understand how to think well about worship and create spaces of encounter, no matter the given context. Great worship leaders are equippers. They're always developing others and finding themselves energized in that development process. Great worship leaders are pastoral. They actually deeply care about the discipleship life of the communities they lead, their bandmates, other leaders that they're mentoring and developing. Great worship leaders are proficient. They're skilled and effective at what they do, musically, creatively, in their studies of worship history, what holidays mean, in their understanding of what to do in a funeral worship set, what to do in a large conference worship set that has many different denominations in it. Great worship leaders are good at that. They're pastoral. They want to do what would be God's highest and best for that particular gathering. Why? Because they understand that they are there to give and not to take, though God will bless us in our worship leading. They understand that they are there primarily to give, and then that God will enable them to receive on the back end. They care about people becoming like Jesus, even if it means them stepping off the platform for a short time or an extended period of time. Great worship leaders are proficient. They're getting better at what they do musically, creatively. They're learning how to arrange bands better or small groups. They're seeking to get better at their chops. They're seeking to develop, again, in their understanding of the church year, in their understanding of worship theology and worldview, in their understanding of how to embody values in a community, in worship, and in its discipleship life. They're proficient at all these things, but musically, creatively, they're always in a state of growth. Great worship leaders understand authority, who guides what, and they can defer. They have a wonderful humility about them. And I've watched some very influential worship leaders defer in many settings where I don't even know if I would have, but they did. And I watched God honor and develop them. And I was developed, in that same stroke by watching them. Then, of course, great worship leaders are passionate. Great worship leaders also, and just capping this all off, they can separate their personal emotional state from what the moment calls for in the group that they're leading. I don't know that art is learned by any other method than experience, where our emotions are telling us one thing. They may even be telling us, you can't lead worship today. And yet something in us says, do it anyway. Build the set the way you know how, and create a space of encounter. Worship leaders aren't led by their emotions. They are leaders. They are led by their values, their sense of co-mission with God. You know, emotions, as Dallas Willard said, are a wonderful servant, but they're a terrible master. And great worship leaders have learned to master their emotions, release them at all the appropriate times in passion, but then also to restrain them at all the appropriate times in order to do what they plan to do and what they believe God said to do earlier. Now, that's a whole journey for exploration. But these qualities, I believe, make a great worship leader. If we can attend to them, if we can grow in them, if we can develop others in them, we will watch a generation of highly effective worship leaders who are very capable in drawing people from many different streams, many different spiritual maturities, many different contexts, even unbelievers, believers, to a place of encounter with the living God on a regular basis, and then to do so over the long haul. These are the kind of desirable worship leaders I believe that we need and are forming in our generation. I want to bless you to be a great worship leader for a moment, if I could do this. Let's just join our hearts in prayer together. Lord, I ask that your hand would be on each one of us listening to this. That your hand would be upon us with favor from you, in order to see our lives expand into this kind of great worship leadership, effective, fruitful, abounding worship leadership that you have called us each to embody, to live out in our context. Lord, we lay down our need for visibility or platform, our need to be seen by others as cool or hip or whatever it might be. We lay all that down that we might join with you in serving your church in worship. And I ask that your kingdom would come, that you would fan into flame your gifts within each one of us listening, that you would call us to be that unique worship leader that we are called to be, and at the same time to grow, oh Lord, to grow in our ability to plan well, to equip well, to consistently lead well, our abilities on our instruments, our ability to grow as a disciple and passionately worship ourselves. We look to you for favor with you on each one of our worship leadership. I bless you in the name of the living God to be a fruitful worship leader in your context. In Jesus' name. In Jesus' name. Thanks for listening. Bless you in becoming a great worship leader.